The last person anyone expected to still be inside the mansion was a child. It was past midnight when the Mafia boss returned from a meeting. His men waited outside. He walked in alone, but then a sound. Not footsteps, not whispers. A quiet rustling coming from the kitchen pantry. He pulled out his gun. Any other night, an intruder meant blood. Tonight, it meant something far worse. He opened the pantry door and froze. There, crouched in the corner, was a little girl. Skinny, shivering, eyes wide like she'd been caught stealing from God himself. In her hands, a half-eaten piece of bread and a small container of cold pasta the staff had thrown away. She wasn't a thief. She wasn't a spy. She was starving. And when the Mafia boss stepped closer, she whispered the words that shattered him. "Please don't fire my mommy. She didn't know I followed her to work." His chest tightened. His throat burned. Her mother, his maid, was the only worker who never complained, never asked for more hours, never said a word about her life outside those mansion walls. Now he understood why. The girl tried to hide the food behind her back, as if protecting it would protect her mother too. For a long moment, the Mafia boss said nothing. Then he quietly put his gun away and did something none of his men would ever believe. Stay with me until the end. Because what he did next left every maid, every guard, and every man in that mansion absolutely speechless. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. Vincent Torino had built his empire on fear. For 30 years, his name alone could silence a room, empty a restaurant, or make grown men cross themselves and pray. The Torino family controlled every street corner, every dock, every piece of business that mattered in the city. His mansion sat like a fortress on the hill, marble floors polished to perfection, crystal chandeliers casting shadows that seemed to dance with secrets. But standing in that pantry, staring at a child who couldn't have been more than 8 years old, Vincent felt something crack inside his chest, something he thought had died long ago when he'd chosen this life over everything else. The girl's name was Isabella. He'd seen her once before, maybe twice, when her mother Carmen brought her to work during school holidays. Carmen Martinez had worked for the Torino family for 3 years, arriving before dawn and leaving after sunset. She cleaned the blood off his floors without asking questions. She prepared meals for his men without flinching when they discussed their business. She was invisible in the way good help should be. But this child, trembling in his pantry with crumbs on her fingers and tears streaming down her hollow cheeks, made everything visible. Vincent crouched down slowly, his expensive suit creasing against his knees. Isabella pressed herself further into the corner, clutching that container of leftover pasta like it was treasure. Up close, he could see the holes in her shoes, the way her clothes hung loose on her thin frame, the dark circles under her eyes that spoke of too many hungry nights. "How long have you been coming here?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Isabella's lips trembled. She couldn't speak. Fear had stolen her voice. Vincent tried again, softer this time. "Isabella, right? That's your name?" A tiny nod. Her eyes darted toward the kitchen door, probably wondering if she could run past him. "Your mama. She works very hard for me. She's a good woman." He paused, studying the child's face. "But she doesn't know you've been taking food, does she?" Isabella shook her head violently. Fresh tears spilled over. "Please," she finally whispered, her voice so small it broke something inside him. "Please don't tell her. She'll be so mad. She says we're not charity cases. She says we don't take what isn't ours." The words hit Vincent like bullets. Carmen had pride. Even when she was clearly struggling, even when her daughter was eating garbage, she had too much pride to ask for help. It was admirable and heartbreaking at the same time. Vincent sat back on his heels, really looking at this child. When was the last time he'd seen genuine innocence? When was the last time someone had looked at him with fear that wasn't born of violence or threats, but of a child's desperate love for her mother? "How often are you hungry, Isabella?" She bit her lip, conflict written across her young features, truth warred with loyalty. Sometimes, she whispered, when Mama has to pay for the medicine. Medicine? For her cough. She coughs a lot at night. The doctor says she needs special medicine, but it costs too much. Isabella's words tumbled out now, as if a dam had burst. She doesn't know I hear her crying when she thinks I'm asleep. She thinks I don't know she gives me her food and tells me she already ate. Vincent's hands clenched into fists, not from anger at the child, but from a rage so pure it surprised him. This woman, this good woman, was starving herself and watching her daughter waste away because she was too proud to ask for help from a man who threw away more money in a week than she made in a year. He thought about his own childhood, about the nights when there wasn't enough food, about watching his own mother make impossible choices. That hunger had driven him to this life, had made him ruthless enough to take what he wanted instead of begging for scraps. But Isabella wasn't him. She was just a child who loved her mother enough to sneak into a dangerous man's house and eat his garbage. Vincent stood slowly, his mind racing. Behind him, he heard footsteps in the kitchen, heavy boots on marble. One of his men, probably wondering what was taking so long. "Boss?" Marco's voice carried through the pantry door. "Everything all right in there?" Vincent looked down at Isabella, who had gone, rigid with fresh terror. She knew who these men were. She knew what they were capable of. "Stay here," Vincent told her quietly. "Don't move. Don't make a sound." He stepped out of the pantry, closing the door behind him. Marco stood in the kitchen doorway, hand resting on his gun. The man's eyes were sharp, alert, scanning for threats. "Thought I heard something," Vincent said casually. "Just checking the security." Marco nodded, but his gaze lingered on the pantry door. "You sure, boss?" Sounded like voices. This was the moment. Vincent could tell Marco about the child. His lieutenant would handle it quietly, efficiently. Carmen would be fired. Isabella would disappear into the system, just another statistic. Problem solved. Instead, Vincent did something that would change everything. "Just me, Marco. Talking to myself. Getting old, I guess." He moved toward the kitchen door, steering Marco away from the pantry. "Come on, it's late. Time to call it a night." As they walked through the mansion toward the front entrance, Vincent's mind was already working. Plans were forming, calculations being made. But for the first time in decades, those calculations weren't about profit or power or eliminating threats. They were about a little girl who was brave enough to risk everything for a piece of stale bread, and a mother who was too proud to accept help even when she was drowning. Vincent Torino was about to do something that would shock everyone who knew him, something that would make his enemies question his strength and his allies question his sanity. He was about to show mercy, real mercy, the kind that didn't come with strings attached or debts to be paid. And it all started with a child in his pantry, eating leftovers like they were a feast. Feast. The next morning arrived with the kind of silence that comes before storms. Vincent hadn't slept. He'd spent the hours before dawn in his study, staring at financial records that suddenly looked different through new eyes. Every expense, every luxury, every frivolous purchase now measured against the image of a child eating scraps in his pantry. Carmen arrived at 5:30, just as she did every morning. Vincent watched from his office window as she climbed the servants' stairs, her movements careful and deliberate. She had no idea that her carefully constructed world was about to shift on its axis. He waited, let her begin her routine. Let her believe this was just another ordinary day in the Torino mansion, but nothing would be ordinary after this. At 7 sharp, Vincent walked into the kitchen. Carmen was there, preparing breakfast for the household staff. Her back was straight, her movements efficient, but he noticed things now that he'd missed before. The way she favored her left side, the shallow breathing that suggested her cough was worse than Isabella had let on, the careful way she portioned food, as if every ounce mattered. "Carmen," he said quietly. She turned, surprise flickering across her weathered features. In 3 years, he'd spoken directly to her maybe a dozen times. Bosses like Vincent Torino didn't make small talk with the help. "Mr. Torino, sir." She wiped her hands on her apron, nervous. "Is there something you need? Something wrong with your room? Sit down." The color drained from her face. In her world, being asked to sit meant termination. It meant the end of steady income, the end of health insurance, the end of the only job that kept her and Isabella afloat. "Sir, please, if I've done something wrong." "Sit down, Carmen." She lowered herself into one of the kitchen chairs, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Vincent could see her trembling, though she tried to hide it. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down too. This simple act, a mafia boss sitting at his own kitchen table with his maid, would have sent shockwaves through his organization if anyone had witnessed it. "Tell me about your daughter." Carmen's eyes went wide. Fear and confusion battled across her face. "Isabella? Sir, she's never been in your house, I swear it. She knows the rules. She stays home after school, does her homework." "Carmen." His voice was gentle but firm. "I know." Those two words hung in the air like a death sentence. Carmen's face crumpled, and Vincent watched a strong woman begin to break apart before his eyes. "Please," she whispered. "Please don't fire me. I'll make sure she never comes back. I'll find someone to watch her. I'll pay for after-school care somehow. Just please don't take away our only income." Vincent leaned forward. "How long has she been hungry?" The question caught Carmen off guard. She'd been preparing for anger, for threats, for consequences. She hadn't expected this. "I don't know what you mean, sir." "Carmen." His voice carried the weight of authority, but underneath it was something she'd never heard from him before. Concern. "How long has your daughter been hungry?" The dam broke. Tears she'd been holding back for months, maybe years, finally spilled over. "Since the medical bills started piling up. Since the insurance company denied my claim for the third time. Since the rent went up and the grocery prices doubled and I had to choose between her medicine and food." The words poured out in a rush. Years of struggle compressed into painful honesty. "I give her everything I can, but it's never enough. She pretends she's full when I know she's not. She tells me she had a big lunch at school when I know they're serving portions that wouldn't fill a bird." Vincent felt that familiar rage building, but it wasn't directed at Carmen or Isabella. It was aimed at a system that let good people fall through the cracks, at his own blindness to the suffering happening under his own roof. "The medicine," he said. "What's it for?" Carmen's hand moved unconsciously to her chest. "Lung infection that won't clear up. Started as a cold, but it keeps coming back worse each time. The doctor says I need expensive antibiotics, maybe surgery if it gets worse." She looked up at him with desperate eyes. "But I can't afford to be sick, Mr. Torino. I can't afford to miss work. This job, it's all we have." Vincent studied her face, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time. She was younger than he'd thought, maybe early 40s, but hardship had aged her. There were lines around her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and worries that never ended. Her hands were rough from cleaning chemicals. Her shoulders curved from years of bending over other people's messes. This woman had been slowly dying in his house, and he'd never noticed. "Where is Isabella now?" "At school. She'll go home after, do her homework, wait for me." Carmen's voice was barely audible. "Sir, she's a good girl. She knows not to bother anyone, not to ask for anything. I've taught her to be invisible." Invisible. The word hit Vincent like a physical blow. He'd built his empire by making his enemies disappear, by erasing threats and obstacles. But this woman and her daughter had made themselves invisible out of necessity, out of survival. They'd erased themselves so completely that he'd never seen their pain. "Stand up, Carmen." She obeyed, though her legs seemed unsteady. Vincent reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. Carmen flinched, probably thinking he was calling security to have her escorted out. Instead, he dialed a number she didn't recognize. "Dr. Reeves, Vincent Torino? I need a house call today. Full medical workup, complete physical, chest x-rays, blood work, whatever you think is necessary." He paused, looking directly at Carmen. "And I need it done with complete discretion." Carmen's mouth fell open. "1 hour." Vincent continued into the phone. My address. Send the bill to my personal account. He hung up and looked at the woman who was staring at him as if he'd grown a second head. Mr. Torino, I can't accept. You're not accepting anything. You're following orders. His voice carried that familiar edge of authority. Dr. Reeves is the best pulmonologist in the city. He'll examine you, determine what treatment you need, and make sure you get it. Carmen shook her head, pride warring with desperation. I can't pay for... You're not paying for anything. This is a business expense. But sir, I don't understand. Why would you... Vincent stood up, his decision made. What he was about to do would change everything. Not just for Carmen and Isabella, but for him too. His men would question his judgment. His enemies would see it as weakness. His allies would wonder if he'd lost his edge. But for the first time in 30 years, Vincent Torino was about to make a decision based not on profit or power, but on something far more dangerous: compassion. Because, he said, his voice steady and sure, no child should have to steal scraps from my kitchen to survive. Not in my house. Not on my watch. Carmen broke down completely then, sobbing into her hands. Vincent stood there awkwardly for a moment, unused to tears that weren't born of fear or pain he'd caused. Then he did something else that would have shocked his organization to its core. He placed a gentle hand on Carmen's shoulder and waited for her to compose herself. When she finally looked up, her eyes red but filled with something he rarely saw directed at him: gratitude without fear. Vincent made another decision that would ripple through his entire world. There's more we need to discuss, he said. About your position here. About Isabella's future. About changes that need to be made. Carmen wiped her eyes, confusion replacing relief. Changes, sir? Vincent looked around his gleaming kitchen, at the abundance that surrounded him, at the waste he'd never bothered to notice. Then he thought about a brave little girl eating leftovers in his pantry, protecting her mother with the same fierce loyalty that had once driven him to protect his own family. Everything is about to change, Carmen, for all of us. What Vincent did next would become legend in the halls of his mansion, whispered about in hushed tones by staff who couldn't believe their eyes. He walked to his private office and opened a safe that contained more money than most people saw in a lifetime. But he didn't reach for cash. Instead, he pulled out a small leather notebook, the kind he used to keep track of debts and territories. This time, he was writing something entirely different. Within an hour, 3 black cars pulled up to the mansion's service entrance. Not his usual men. These were different. A doctor, a lawyer, and someone else entirely. Vincent had made calls that would reshape everything. Dr. Reeves finished his examination of Carmen in the mansion's guest quarters. The diagnosis was worse than Vincent had expected. Advanced pneumonia complicated by malnutrition and exhaustion. Without immediate treatment, Carmen had maybe 6 months. She needs hospitalization, Dr. Reeves told Vincent privately. Surgery within the week. The infection has spread to both lungs. Vincent nodded grimly. Cost? For everything? Complete treatment, recovery, follow-up care? We're looking at close to $200,000. $200,000. Vincent spent more than that on a single dinner party for his associates. He'd lost more than that in a poker game just last month and laughed about it. Handle it, he said simply. Private room, best care available. I don't want her worrying about anything except getting better. But that was just the beginning. While Carmen rested upstairs, sedated and finally breathing easier thanks to emergency medication Dr. Reeves had administered, Vincent sat in his study with his lawyer, restructuring something that had never been restructured before. You want to do what? Michael Rossetti, his attorney for 15 years, stared at Vincent like he'd announced plans to join the priesthood. Set up a trust fund. Full college tuition, living expenses, everything Isabella needs until she's 25. Vincent's voice was matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing a routine business transaction. I also want to establish a medical fund for Carmen. Ongoing health care. Whatever she needs for the rest of her life. Michael leaned back in his leather chair, processing this information. Vincent, you understand what you're saying? This isn't a business investment. This isn't buying loyalty or silence. This is just giving money away. I understand perfectly. The other families will see this as weakness. Your own men will question your judgment. You're talking about spending close to $500,000 on a maid and her daughter. Vincent turned to face the window overlooking his gardens. In the distance, he could see the city lights twinkling like stars. Somewhere out there, in a small apartment he'd never seen, Isabella was probably doing homework at a kitchen table, wondering why her mother hadn't come home yet. Michael, in 30 years of this business, how many people have I killed? The lawyer shifted uncomfortably. I don't keep count of those things, Vincent. You know that. I do. 43. 43 human beings whose last sight on this earth was my face. Vincent's reflection stared back at him from the dark window. You know what I realized tonight? I can't remember a single one of their names, but I'll never forget the look in that little girl's eyes when she begged me not to fire her mother. Michael was quiet for a long moment. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he asked, "What's really happening here, Vincent? This isn't like you." Vincent turned back to his oldest friend, his most trusted advisor. Maybe that's the problem, Michael. Maybe being like me isn't something worth being anymore. The next morning brought chaos of a different kind. Word had spread through the mansion's staff like wildfire. Carmen Martinez, the quiet maid who never spoke above a whisper, had been taken to the city's most expensive private hospital in Vincent Torino's personal limousine. Dr. Reeves himself had overseen her transfer, with instructions that every comfort be provided. But that wasn't the shocking part. The shocking part was what Vincent did when Isabella arrived at the mansion after school, looking for her mother. The 8-year-old girl stood in the servants' entrance, her school backpack clutched tightly, her eyes wide with fear. She'd been told to come here if there was ever an emergency, if her mother didn't come home, but she'd never imagined she'd actually have to do it. Vincent found her there, small and lost in the grand hallway that dwarfed her tiny frame. She looked up at him with those same desperate eyes from the night before, and he felt that strange crack in his chest widen into something that felt almost like a heart. "Isabella," he said, gently, crouching down to her level. "Your mama is going to be okay. Where is she?" Isabella's voice was barely audible. "She didn't come home last night. She always comes home. She's at the hospital, getting the medicine she needs. The good doctors are taking care of her." Isabella's bottom lip trembled. "Is it because of me? Because I took the food? Did she get sick because I was bad?" The question hit Vincent like a physical blow. This child, this innocent little girl, was blaming herself for her mother's illness. She thought her desperate act of hunger had somehow caused her mother's suffering. "No, sweetheart," Vincent said, and the endearment surprised them both. "Your mama got sick because sometimes people get sick. It has nothing to do with you being hungry. Nothing at all. But the food I took was thrown away anyway. You didn't steal anything, Isabella. You were just trying to survive." Vincent stood up and made a decision that would scandalize his entire organization. He extended his hand to the little girl. "Come with me. I want to show you something." Isabella hesitated, then placed her small hand in his large one. Vincent led her through the mansion, past marble statues and priceless paintings, up the grand staircase that servants were never allowed to use. His men watched in stunned silence as their boss, the most feared man in the city, walked hand in hand with a little girl in worn sneakers and a faded school uniform. Vincent brought Isabella to his private dining room, the one reserved for his most important business meetings. The long mahogany table could seat 20 people, and it was set with crystal glasses and gold-rimmed china that cost more than most people's monthly salary. "Sit anywhere you like," Vincent told her. Isabella stared at the opulent room, overwhelmed. "I'm not supposed to be here. Mama says I'm not allowed in the fancy parts of the house. Today, the rules are different." Vincent pressed a button on the wall, and within minutes, his personal chef appeared. Giuseppe had prepared meals for presidents and kings. had trained in the finest restaurants in Italy. Giuseppe, Vincent said, I'd like you to prepare whatever Isabella wants for dinner. Anything at all. The chef looked confused but nodded. He turned to Isabella with a professional smile. What would you like, little miss? Isabella's eyes filled with tears. The simple question overwhelmed her. When was the last time someone had asked her what she wanted to eat? When was the last time she'd had a choice? I don't know, she whispered. Just anything that's not too expensive. Giuseppe looked at Vincent, who nodded almost imperceptibly. How about, the chef said gently, I make you the best grilled cheese sandwich you've ever had? With tomato soup? And maybe some cookies for dessert? Isabella's face lit up like the sun breaking through clouds. Really? With real cheese? The best cheese in the world. As Giuseppe hurried to the kitchen, Vincent sat down beside Isabella at the enormous table. She looked so small in the high-backed chair, her feet dangling above the floor. Isabella, Vincent said carefully, I need to tell you something important. Your mama is going to be in the hospital for a while, maybe a few weeks. Fresh tears spilled down Isabella's cheeks. What happens to me? Where do I go? Vincent had been asking himself the same question all day. The logical answer was foster care, temporary placement with a family approved by the state. But every time he imagined this brave little girl in some stranger's house, scared and alone, that crack in his chest split a little wider. You're going to stay here, he heard himself say. With me. Isabella's eyes went wide. Here? In your house? In your house, Vincent corrected. This is your home now, Isabella, for as long as you need it to be. The words hung in the air like a promise that would change everything Vincent thought he knew about himself, about family, about what it meant to protect someone not out of obligation or business necessity, but out of something far more dangerous, love. Giuseppe returned with a silver tray bearing the most elaborate grilled cheese sandwich Vincent had ever seen. Golden brown bread, melted cheese oozing from the sides, tomato soup in a fine china bowl, and a plate of chocolate chip cookies still warm from the oven. Isabella ate with the careful politeness her mother had taught her, but Vincent could see the way her eyes lit up with each bite. Real food. Enough food. Food she didn't have to hide or feel guilty about eating. Is it good? Vincent asked. Isabella nodded enthusiastically, her mouth full of sandwich. When she swallowed, she looked at him with an expression he'd never seen directed at him before. Pure, uncomplicated gratitude. Mr. Vincent, she said, and his heart clenched at the way she said his name. Are you really going to let me stay here until Mama gets better? Yes. Even though I'm not important? The question stopped Vincent cold. What makes you think you're not important? Isabella shrugged, suddenly fascinated by her soup. Mama always says we have to stay invisible. That important people don't want to see people like us. That we should be grateful for whatever we get, and never ask for more. Vincent felt that familiar rage building, but this time it was directed at a world that had taught an 8-year-old girl that she didn't matter, that her life, her hunger, her dreams were somehow less valuable because of the circumstances of her birth. Isabella, look at me. She raised her eyes to his. You are the most important person in this house right now. Do you understand that? She shook her head, confusion written across her young features. Your mama loves you so much that she made herself sick trying to take care of you, and you love her so much that you risked everything to try to help her. That kind of love, that's the most important thing in the world. Vincent reached across the table and gently squeezed Isabella's small hand. You're not invisible anymore, sweetheart. Not in this house. Not ever again. As Isabella finished her meal, Vincent's phone buzzed with messages from his lieutenants, his business associates, his enemies. Word was spreading through the underworld like wildfire. Vincent Torino, the most ruthless boss in the city, had gone soft. He'd taken in a child. He was spending a fortune on charity. Some saw it as weakness, others as a trap, some elaborate scheme they couldn't yet decipher. They were all wrong. What Vincent Torino had found in his pantry wasn't just a hungry child. He'd found a mirror that showed him who he really was beneath 30 years of violence and fear. And more importantly, he'd found who he could become. The transformation was just beginning. Beginning. That evening, as Isabella slept in a bedroom larger than her entire apartment, Vincent stood in his study reviewing reports that suddenly seemed meaningless. Territory disputes, collection schedules, profit margins, numbers on paper that had once consumed his every waking moment. Now all he could think about was a little girl who said please and thank you even while eating scraps from his garbage. His phone rang. The caller ID showed the hospital. "Mr. Torino, this is Dr. Reeves. I wanted to update you on Carmen's condition." Vincent pressed the phone to his ear, surprised by how much the answer mattered to him. "The surgery went better than expected. We were able to clear most of the infection. She's stable, but recovery will take time. Weeks, possibly months before she's back to full strength." Relief flooded through Vincent's chest. And long-term. With proper care and rest, she should make a complete recovery. "But Mr. Torino, I need you to understand something. This woman has been pushing herself past her limits for years. Her body is exhausted. Even after the infection clears, she'll need time to rebuild her strength." Vincent nodded, though the doctor couldn't see him. "Whatever she needs, time is not an issue." After hanging up, Vincent walked upstairs to check on Isabella. She was fast asleep in the guest room, curled up in the center of a bed that could have fit 4 of her. Her school clothes were folded neatly on a chair, and she clutched a small stuffed rabbit that looked like it had seen better days. For a moment, Vincent just watched her breathe. When was the last time he'd been in the presence of such complete innocence? When was the last time someone had trusted him enough to sleep peacefully under his roof? The next morning brought Vincent's first real test. 6 months later, Vincent Torino's mansion looked the same from the outside. Same marble columns, same iron gates, same reputation that made people cross the street rather than walk too close. But inside, everything had changed. Carmen returned to work, but not as a maid. Vincent had promoted her to head of household operations, overseeing the staff with the dignity she'd always deserved. Her health had fully returned, and with it, a confidence that transformed how she carried herself through those marble halls. Isabella thrived in ways that surprised everyone, especially Vincent. She excelled in the private school he'd enrolled her in, made friends with the groundskeeper's grandchildren, and somehow managed to turn the most feared man in the city into someone who knew the difference between chocolate chip and oatmeal raisin cookies. But the real transformation was Vincent himself. His men still feared him. His enemies still respected his power. But something fundamental had shifted. He found himself asking different questions in business meetings. Not just about profit, but about people. Not just about taking, but about giving back. The other crime families whispered that Vincent Torino had gone soft. Some even tested his resolve with small territorial challenges. They learned quickly that compassion and ruthlessness could coexist in the same man. Vincent was still dangerous, perhaps more so now that he had something worth protecting. One evening, as Vincent sat in his study reviewing legitimate business proposals, Isabella appeared in his doorway, wearing her school uniform and carrying a drawing. "Mr. Vincent," she said, using the name she'd never stopped calling him despite his gentle corrections. "I made this for you." The drawing showed a stick figure man in a black suit standing next to a much smaller stick figure girl. Both were smiling. At the top, in careful 8-year-old handwriting, she'd written, "My family." Vincent stared at the paper, that familiar crack in his chest widening until it felt like his heart might actually burst. This child, who had once eaten his scraps in secret, now claimed him as family. Not because she had to, not because she feared him, but because somewhere along the way, love had grown in the space where fear used to live. "Thank you, Isabella," he managed, his voice rougher than usual. "This is the most beautiful thing anyone has ever given me." She beamed and skipped away, leaving Vincent alone with his drawing and the realization that everything he'd thought he wanted from life had been wrong. Power meant nothing if you had no one to share it with. Fear was a poor substitute for respect, and sometimes the most important business decision you could make had nothing to do with business at all. That night, Vincent called his lawyer one more time. Not about territories or deals or eliminating problems, but about adoption papers, because Isabella Martinez was about to become Isabella Torino, officially and permanently. The girl who had once hidden in his pantry eating leftovers would now inherit everything he'd built, not because she was blood, but because she'd taught him that family isn't about DNA. It's about choosing to love someone so completely that their happiness becomes more important than your own survival. And that's a lesson worth more than any empire. Sometimes the smallest acts of courage lead to the greatest transformations. A hungry child's desperate whisper didn't just save her family, it saved the soul of a man who thought his was lost forever.